Whenever I chat with people who are about to travel, they oftentimes have no clue how they're going to move around once they reach their destination. Most believe that they can just grab an Uber outside the airport just like they would at home, but oftentimes this is not the case. This is even more important consideration because when people travel, the number one injury-related fatality they're going to encounter would be related to road traffic accidents. As a result, no matter where you're traveling to, it's critical to understand what your safe transportation options are, and some of the ones that will come up will be in relation to ride shares and also taxi services. It's important to research those beforehand, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. The pros and cons of those, and what to look for when you're about to go to get an Uber or a taxi in a location that's outside of your comfort zone. Hi, my name is Evan. I've advised hundreds of people on how to travel safely in locations all over the globe. Before we start, if you are interested in these videos, if you've liked what you've seen already, please like and subscribe just so that you can see more coming up. So let's jump into the pros and cons of using ride shares such as Uber or Lyft. So ride shares have become increasingly popular, not just in the United States where they originated from, but in locations in every corner of the globe. The most common rideshare company is Uber in the US and also Europe and other locations, but there's also Lyft, which exists here in the US and Canada, for example. There are other companies that represent certain parts of the world, for example, Ola in India, Bolt, which exists in parts of Africa and Europe, Careem, which exists in parts of Africa and the Middle East. There are others too, so just keep in mind if you're going to some kind of location, you should look and see what kind of rideshare may be available to you. So let's talk about the pros of using a rideshare. So the mobile apps are really easy to use, and basically every one of these services will have some kind of mobile app that will allow you to track where you're going. It will provide you sort of real-time cost for that particular trip and allows you to track your own rating, the driver rating, everything else that we're going to kind of get into here in a few minutes. There's also real-time route tracking as well. So this is a huge safety benefit for you. So you can see exactly where you are on the trip, that you're not being taken for a ride outside of where you're supposed to be going, and that you're going to the correct location. Driver ratings are also very, very helpful. So driver ratings allow you to check and see, if the driver has had many rides or also what their rating is on a scale of 5. And then the last pro would be availability. So if you're going to a major city, it's likely that you'll find availability very widely if you're using some kind of rideshare. I find that if you go to rural areas, sometimes it can be a little more limited, but even then, availability will still be there, especially during regular hours. In terms of rideshare cons, one of the biggest cons is that drivers are not actually direct employees of a company like Uber or Lyft. So they tend to be subcontractors of those particular companies, and it makes the relationship a little bit different in the sense that they don't have to answer directly to the company, and the company, doesn't have to be directly responsible for what they do. Drivers can also vary in quality, and rideshare companies tend to only sort of limit their ability to drive for them based on, severe traffic crimes or some kind of severe criminal background that comes up within the background check. The other big con would be that vehicles may vary in quality. So cars in some jurisdictions may be better kept than others just based on what those minimum standards are in that location. So this varies in the United States from state to state, depending on what those inspection standards are. But then the same can be said from country to country as well. So if you go to a country somewhere, outside of what we would call, quote unquote, the West, for lack of a better term, then you may find that those standards are a little less in terms of those inspections. And then the last thing I would say in terms of a con is really, if you need to use cash for any reason for a particular trip, it's going to be a lot harder for you. So most of these systems will only allow you to pay with some form of credit card or a mobile payment system, which can limit your ability, especially if you don't have access to credit or that mobile payment system while you're in that location. So next, let's talk about some tips for checking the safety of rideshare. So we talked about driver ratings being one of those pros of the application and the system itself. So always look at the driver ratings, make sure that they have high ratings with a lot of rides to ensure that you've found a driver that is going to be consistently safe with you. Low ratings may mean that they are poor drivers, but it could also mean that they have poor customer service. So just note that it's not a direct correlation, but it's kind of a good indication of a driver that's going to, get you from point A to point B in a safe manner. Before you enter the car, always check that the vehicle description and license plate actually match what's on the app directly. They'll also provide you, this description just so you can pick out that car within a group of cars, but it's important to make sure that those match directly. Ensure the driver matches their name and photo. So most of these apps will require them to have a photo and also their name in there, which will also show you the rating as well. But you should always make sure that these match directly. Otherwise, I wouldn't ever enter that particular rideshare. Also, do a quick check of the car. Obviously, you're not going to be able to do some full inspection, right? But, if it looks like it's been in an accident, that's usually probably an indication that you shouldn't take that particular vehicle. If it looks like it's been poorly kept or, someone hasn't worked to keep it up regularly, then that's also a good indication that it might not be a good vehicle to ride in. And then the most important one is really making sure that the seatbelt works and it fully clicks in. That's going to ensure that you're safe, which leads me to my next point. Always, always, always wear your seatbelt. That's incredibly important to help reduce the risk of fatalities in some kind of road traffic accident. The last point here is in relation to calling a rideshare close to a taxi stand. So this may not be an issue in every location, but in places where rideshares may be partially legal or fully illegal, oftentimes if they're close to a taxi stand, it can be controversial. You should know that rideshares have taken away the business from taxi drivers and caused, greater competition. So as a result, there is tension between drivers of taxis and rideshares like Uber. So just make sure that you're aware of that and avoid calling an Uber or a Lyft or any of the others that I mentioned that close to a taxi stand. Jumping over to taxis can be a great alternative to ride shares. Obviously, they've been around in one form or another for over 130 years, right? So in the 1890s, when taxis were first introduced sort of en masse in locations in Europe, then also in the United States. They often are the main competition for rideshares like Uber. However, I would kind of reverse that, right? The rideshare companies have been the ones that have been the competition for the taxis. Taxi companies usually employ their drivers directly, or it could be that some taxi drivers actually own their cabs outright. Either way, there's more of a direct link between that company and the driver, unlike with a rideshare, like we discussed previously. It can also be cheaper than ride shares. So I find, in a lot of major cities within the United States, it could be that a taxi is actually cheaper than, an Uber or Lyft. In locations where you are unsure of transportation, really the easiest thing you can do is request your hotel or accommodation to book you a taxi service that they recommend. They're unlikely to provide you some kind of unsafe form of transportation. So as long as you get them to recommend it and book it for you, it's always going to be something that's going to be relatively safe for any trip outside of, that immediate vicinity. One thing to keep in mind is that taxis usually have meters. So meter scams have been an issue for years and years and years. But some things to look out for, right? If the taxi driver is going to be driving you around in, a place that seems off the beaten path, could it be an indication that they're trying to run up the meter and, cost you more money ultimately? So a couple of things with that. If you are going to negotiate the fare from the start of the journey, just make sure that, everyone is clear on the amount, that they don't start the meter at that point. And then if you are going to use the meter, make sure that the meter begins right at the start of the journey, so everything is completely up to snuff, so to speak. And then the last thing would be in places that you don't really know how to use the taxi system, you should always make sure that you take the taxi directly from the taxi stand. So a good example would be in some places you may arrive at the airport, walk out of the arrivals area and find that you're bombarded by a bunch of people asking if you need some kind of particular form of transportation. and they may or may not be actual taxi drivers. So they could just be someone who's not certified to be a taxi driver. So it's really important to use the taxi stand. There may be a long line, but it's going to be a safer alternative than just jumping in someone's vehicle, regardless of what's going on around you. So overall, rideshares and taxis share sort of a similar space for transportation when you travel. It's really important to recognize that both of them have benefits and issues. I've used both of them in various places, so keep in mind that they are available to you either way, but you just need to know how to use them properly. Always research before you go. So this is something that we speak of, in every single one of these videos, it seems, but it's really important, right? You don't want to be in a position where you don't know what is safe or acceptable in that particular place if you're trying to go from point A to point B, especially in a country that you're not familiar with. And then the other part that ties into, my recommendation about using, the hotel staff to get you a taxi, for example, would be really leaning on local knowledge. So, locals can provide you that advice that is invaluable to indicate, what is going to be the best option for you, especially as an international traveler coming to a destination that may be, pretty far from what you're used to. So that's an overall sort of overview of the rideshare versus taxi situation. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate that people are engaged and excited to be watching these videos. So if you're looking for more, stay tuned. More will be coming out soon. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day, and thanks so much. Bye.